The spring that belonged to the mountain had been dry since the previous autumn. Samuel Garrett had walked every ridge and gully on his land, looking for where the water had gone, and he had not found it. The creek bed that once fed the lower pasture was nothing but cracked mud and pale stones. His cattle were thinning. His well was down to a trickle that smelled of iron and tasted of despair. He had drilled twice already and hit nothing but rock. He stood at the edge of the empty creek now, holding his hat in both hands, turning it slowly the way a man does when he is trying to decide whether to pray or to curse. The auction was not something he had planned to attend. It was held in the yard behind the land office in Benton, Wyoming Territory, on a morning in 1883 that felt more like late summer than early October. The auctioneer, a thick-jawed man named Lyle Sutter, sold off the contents of a failed homestead belonging to a family called Cobb. The father had died of fever. The mother had followed 3 weeks later. What remained was a cart of household goods, a lame mule, and a daughter. The daughter stood beside the cart with her hands folded in front of her. She was young, perhaps 20 or 21, with brown hair pulled back and a thin cotton dress that had been mended more than once. Her eyes were open, but they did not track the crowd. They did not track anything. She was blind, and everyone in the yard knew it. Lyle Sutter sold the mule for $6. He sold the cart and its contents for $9. Then he looked at the girl and scratched the back of his neck. Who will take responsibility for Miss Cobb here? She cannot work a field. She cannot drive stock. But she is able-bodied otherwise, and someone ought to provide. The yard was quiet. A few men shifted on their boots. A woman near the back whispered something to her husband, who shook his head. Samuel had come for the mule. He had lost the bid. He had no reason to stay. But he looked at the girl standing alone beside an empty cart, and he saw the way her chin was lifted, not in defiance exactly, but in the manner of someone who had decided she would not fold no matter what came next. $4. His own voice surprised him. Lyle Sutter blinked. He looked at the crowd. No one else spoke. Sold then. She is your charge, Mr. Garrett. Samuel walked to the girl and stopped 2 paces away. He did not touch her arm. He did not steer her. My name is Samuel Garrett. I have a ranch about 9 miles north of here. I have a spare room. You will not be harmed. She turned her face toward his voice. Her expression did not soften, but something in the set of her shoulders changed, as if a rope she had been holding had gone slack by 1 inch. My name is Eliza Cobb. I can cook, I can mend, I can do more than people think. He nodded, then remembered she could not see the gesture. I believe that. They rode north in his wagon, without speaking, for the first several miles. The road was rutted and dry. Dust rose behind them in a pale curtain. Eliza sat with her hands in her lap and her face turned slightly toward the wind, and Samuel noticed that she tilted her head at every new sound, cataloging the landscape with her ears the way he would with his eyes. When they reached the ranch, she stepped down from the wagon before he could offer a hand. She stood in the yard and breathed in deeply. There is sage, and juniper, and something that smells like rust. That would be the well water. It has been going bad since spring. She nodded slowly. He showed her to the small room at the back of the house. It had a cot, a washstand, and a window that faced east. She ran her fingers along the doorframe and then across the edge of the cot. This is more than I expected. It is not much. It is a door I can close. That is more than I have had in 3 months. He left her to settle in. Outside, he stood on the porch and looked at the dry pasture and the thinning cattle and the sky that promised nothing, and he wondered what he had just done. She cooked supper that evening. He had expected something simple, and what she made was simple, but it was made with a kind of attention he had not seen in years. She found every jar and tin in his kitchen by touch, smelling each one, tasting a grain of salt, a pinch of flour. She moved through the small space without hesitation, her hands always slightly ahead of her body, mapping surfaces the way water maps a slope. The stew she set on the table was better than anything he had eaten in the 2 years since his wife Clara had died. He did not say that. He said only that it was good. But he ate 2 bowls, and when he looked up, Eliza was sitting across from him, with her hands around a tin cup, and there was the smallest trace of satisfaction on her face. That tin cup became hers. She carried it to the porch in the mornings and held it between her palms while she listened to the land wake up. He noticed that she always held it the same way, with both hands, as though it were something precious and not just a dented piece of camp tin he had owned for a decade. The first week passed in a quiet routine. She cooked. She mended a shirt he had torn on a fence post. She swept the kitchen floor and found a crack in the hearthstone he had not noticed. He worked the cattle, checked the well, rode the property line looking for any sign of water. On the 4th day, she asked him about the spring. "You said the water went bad. When did it stop running altogether?" "Last November." There was a tremor in the ground one night, small one. By morning the creek was dry, and you have looked for where it moved to. Every week since, I have walked every draw and canyon on this property. Drilled twice. Nothing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that puzzled him. Water does not disappear. It moves. And it always tells you where it has gone, if you know how to listen. He did not know what to make of that, so he said nothing. By the 2nd week, people in Benton had begun to talk. A rancher named Dale Orton, who owned the largest spread in the valley and had been trying to buy the Garrett land for 2 years, made a point of riding past one afternoon. He sat on his horse at the gate and looked at Eliza, who was hanging laundry on the line by feel, her fingers checking the clothespins with practiced certainty. Dale Orton leaned on his saddle horn and spoke to Samuel as though Eliza were not there. "Heard you bought yourself a blind girl at the Cobb auction. $4, was it? That is about 3 more than she is worth." Samuel set down the fence rail he had been carrying. "She is not property, Dale. She is a person living under my roof. And you can get off my gate." Dale Orton smiled the way a man smiles when he believes time is on his side. "Your well is going dry, Garrett. Your cattle are thinning. You cannot find water on your own land. Come winter you will have to sell, and when you do, I will be the only buyer. Do not make this harder than it needs to be." He rode off. Samuel stood in the yard with his fists at his sides and said nothing. But Eliza, still at the clothesline, had heard every word. She did not mention it. She finished hanging the laundry and went inside and started supper. That night, after they had eaten, she spoke. "How much of the land have you walked looking for this spring?" "Most of it. The North Ridge, the East Draw, the canyon behind the barn. I have been everywhere I can think of. Have you been to the high meadow above the tree line? That is rough ground, loose rock. There is no reason water would surface up there." She turned the tin cup slowly in her hands. "My father was a well digger before we came west. He taught me to listen for water when I was small, before I lost my sight, and after. He said I had a better ear for it than anyone he had known." Samuel looked at her. The lamplight caught the side of her face, and he saw, not for the first time, that she was not fragile. She was still. There was a difference. "You want to walk the high meadow. I want to listen to it." He almost said no. The ground was rough, and she could not see it. But he remembered the way she moved through his kitchen without a single wasted step, and he held his refusal. "I will take you up there tomorrow." They left at dawn. He saddled the horse and she rode behind him, her arms around his waist, and he was aware of her closeness in a way he had not been aware of another person in a very long time. The trail climbed through juniper and scrub pine and then opened onto a wide meadow of dry grass that lay between two ridges of broken granite. He helped her down and she stood in the meadow and did something he did not expect. She took off her boots. She stood barefoot on the ground and was still for a long time. "Walk me to the far edge." Slowly, he offered his arm and she took it, and they walked across the meadow in silence. Her feet moved carefully over the ground, pressing down, pausing, pressing again. Halfway across, she stopped. "Here, the ground is different here." He looked down. It looked the same to him. "It is warmer. And there is a hum, very low. You cannot hear it, but I can feel it through the soles of my feet. Water is moving under this spot. Not deep." He knelt and pressed his hand to the earth. He felt nothing. "I have been ranching this land for 8 years. I have never heard of water running under this meadow. Your father drilled where the maps told him to drill. Water does not read maps." There was no challenge in her voice, just certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from having spent a lifetime paying attention to the one sense that never lied to her. He drove a test stake that afternoon. He returned the next morning with a shovel and a pickaxe and began to dig. At 4 feet, he hit damp clay. At 6 feet, water began to seep through the soil, slow and clear and cold. By the 3rd day, he had opened a channel and the water was running steady. It was not the old spring. It was better. It was higher on the property, fed by snowmelt that had been diverted underground by the tremor the previous autumn. With a simple gravity-fed channel, it could water the entire lower pasture without a pump. He stood at the edge of the new spring, with mud on his boots and water running over his hands, and he felt something break open in his chest that had been sealed shut since Clara died. He was not going to lose the ranch. He was not going to have to sell to Dale Orton. The land would live. He walked back to the house and found Eliza sitting on the porch with the tin cup in her hands. She was listening to a meadowlark. She turned her face toward him as he approached, and he knew she already understood what he had found, because she was smiling. Not broadly, just at the corners of her mouth, the way a person smiles when something they believed has been proven true. "You found it. You found it. I just dug the hole." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and the sound of it went through him like the first warm day after a long winter. Word traveled fast in the valley. Within a week, people in Benton knew that Samuel Garrett had found water on his high meadow and that his ranch was no longer dying. Dale Orton heard it too, and he did not take the news with grace. He came to the ranch on a Tuesday morning with 2 men and a piece of paper. He stood in the yard and announced that he held a lien on the Garrett property from a debt that Samuel had owed to the bank the previous winter, a debt Samuel had already paid in full. Samuel came out of the barn and looked at the paper. It was a forgery, and not a particularly good one, but Dale Orton had a judge in his pocket, and the nearest honest court was in Cheyenne, 200 miles east. "You have 30 days, Garrett. Pay the amount on that paper, or I take the land. I paid that debt in January. I have the receipt. Receipts get lost. The bank has no record of it. 30 days. Dale Orton and his men rode off. Samuel stood in the yard holding the forged paper and felt the ground shifting under him again, not from a tremor this time, but from the simple ugly weight of a man with more power deciding to take what he wanted. Eliza was in the kitchen doorway. She had heard everything. "Is the receipt real?" "Yes, I have it in the strongbox under the bed. Then it is his word against yours. And he has the judge, I know." She was quiet for a moment. Then she stepped out onto the porch and stood beside him. My father lost our first homestead to a man like that, a man who believed that wanting something was the same as deserving it. My father did not fight back because he thought fighting would make it worse. He was wrong. Not fighting was what killed him, not the fever, the shame. Samuel looked at her. The wind moved through her hair, and she stood with her shoulders square and her blind eyes aimed at the horizon, and he thought, not for the first time, that she saw more than most people ever would. He rode to Benton the next morning and walked into the land office and filed a formal dispute on the lien, presenting his original receipt. The clerk, a young man named Thomas Finch, looked at the receipt, looked at the forged document, and looked at Samuel. "This lien is not right, Mr. Garrett. The signatures do not match." But Judge Halloran already stamped it. Samuel set his jaw. "Then we take it to Cheyenne. That could take months. I have water now. I have time." Thomas Finch, who had no love for Dale Orton or for the judge who served him, made a copy of both documents and sealed them for the territorial court. When Samuel returned to the ranch that evening, Eliza had supper on the table and a question waiting. What did they say? "I filed the dispute. It will go to the territorial court in Cheyenne." "And what will Dale Orton do when he finds out?" "Whatever he does, he will find that I am still here." She reached across the table and touched his hand. It was the first time she had touched him deliberately, not for balance or guidance, but simply because she wanted to. Her fingers were warm and rough from work, and her touch lasted only a moment, but he felt it for the rest of the evening like a coal held close against the cold. The weeks that followed were hard, but not hopeless. Dale Orton sent men to cut the fence line twice. Samuel repaired it both times. Orton tried to buy off the feed supplier in town. Samuel hauled his own feed from a depot 40 miles west. Every small cruelty Orton attempted, Samuel answered with quiet endurance, and Eliza answered with steady presence. She kept the house. She kept him fed. She walked the property with him on clear mornings, her hand on his arm, her feet reading the ground. She found a second seep near the eastern fence line and told him exactly where to dig. He dug, and she was right again. One evening in late November, the first snow came. They sat on the porch together watching the flakes come down in the lamplight. She could not see them, but she held her tin cup out and let them fall into it, and she smiled when the cold water gathered at the bottom. "It is beautiful, is it not? Snow falling at night." He looked at her instead of the snow. "Yes, it is." She turned her face toward him, and he knew that she knew he was not talking about the snow. "I did not expect this." He said it quietly, as though saying it too loudly would make it disappear. "Neither did I." The territorial court ruled in February. The lien was declared fraudulent. Dale Orton was fined and stripped of his position on the county land board. Judge Halloran was removed from the bench and replaced by a circuit judge from Cheyenne who had no interest in the politics of the valley. Samuel received the letter on a Thursday. He read it at the kitchen table while Eliza poured coffee. When he finished, he set the letter down and was quiet for a long time. "It is over. The land is clear. The lien is void." Eliza set the coffee pot on the stove and turned to face him. Good, that was all she said, but the way she said it, with the weight of every month of worry dropping out of the word like a stone into still water, told him everything. He stood and walked to where she was standing and took both of her hands in his. "Eliza, I brought you here because I thought you needed a home, but I am the one who was lost. You found the water. You found the way to fight. You found every good thing I had stopped believing was there." She lifted her face toward him. Her eyes, as always, did not focus, but her attention was absolute, the way it was when she listened to the ground for water, the way it was when she listened to a meadowlark or the hiss of snow on a porch rail. I was not looking for someone to save me, Samuel. I was looking for someone who would let me be useful. That is all I ever wanted. To be of use. You are. More than I can say. Then do not say it. Just stay. He lifted her hand and pressed it to his cheek, and she felt the warmth of his skin and the rough edge of his jaw and the wetness at the corner of his eye. And she understood without seeing that this man who had spent a year searching for water had finally found something he did not know he was missing. Spring came early that year. The high meadow spring ran strong and cold, and the new channel carried water down through the pasture in a bright line that caught the morning sun. The cattle drank their fill. The grass came back thick and green. Wildflowers opened in the draw behind the barn, purple and yellow and white, and Eliza walked among them with her bare feet on the wet ground and her face lifted to the sun. Samuel stood at the porch and watched her. He had a tin cup in his hand, the same dented one she had claimed the first week. He had poured fresh spring water into it, and the water was so clear it barely caught the light. She walked back toward the house and climbed the steps and stood beside him. He put the cup into her hands. She held it the way she always did, with both palms, feeling the cold of the water through the tin. From the new spring, she lifted it and drank. The water was sweet and clean and so cold it made her teeth ache. She smiled. Not broadly. Just at the corners of her mouth, the same way she had smiled the day he told her about the water, the day she knew she had been right, the day she understood that what she carried inside her, the listening, the patience, the attention that blindness had sharpened into something almost like sight, was not a burden. It was the most valuable thing on this land. Samuel Garrett had paid $4 at an auction in Benton, Wyoming Territory, and the world had called it charity. But he knew the truth now, standing on his porch with water running through his pasture, and the woman beside him holding a tin cup full of spring water, and the whole green valley spread out before them in the early light. He had not saved her. She had found the thing that saved them both. And he would spend the rest of his life grateful that he had been wise enough, or desperate enough, or simply human enough to say those two small words at the auction that changed everything. $4. The meadowlark sang from the fence post. The water ran. The snow was gone from the ridges, and Eliza Garrett, who could not see any of it, knew exactly where she was. She was home.